Now, our second guest from the UK column is Charles Malet. Charles is a former police detective and infantry soldier and began contributing to UK column news following coverage of his resignation from the police over the introduction of diversive and discriminatory policy and legislation. Here to talk about freedom, please welcome Charles Malet.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Many years ago, a godfather of mine, who was not in any way academically minded, was presented with an essay title which was "Describe Your Enjoyment of Reading." And with huge enthusiasm, he tore into a great expounding of his love for Reading, which he'd come to know quite well as a boy. I hope that by the end of today you will go away with similar emotions because of what it is that you're going to achieve today. And Brian has spoken about the values that you're here gathered together to support, those of freedom, family, and nation, which sounds innocuous enough, although here we are, three pillars of what should be a functioning society under constant threat. So I do commend you for stepping forward as individuals, but also for recognizing that what you want to achieve is far better done collectively. And for today to mean something, you need to take the time to get to know one another, to make those connections, and to go away stronger as a result of it. So, tedious as this may be, what I'm going to encourage you to do now, over the next few seconds, is just turn to the people who are beside, behind, and in front of you, and just introduce yourselves, because we need to do this as people. I'm going to say hello to these people down here, and I want you to do the same, please. All right. I reckon you all feel better for doing that. I hope you all feel better for doing that. I do. Bit of exercise up and down the steps. So that is a positive start, and it's those sorts of simple interactions, exactly like Brian's been talking about, that push us forward as people and as a collective, and in your case, as the Heritage Party. Now, free speech is going to be the topic of this talk, so what I'd like to do is just start with a video which brings the idea of free speech and the Heritage Party together. I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, will have seen it before, but it's worth having a refresher.
Teaching children this kind of thing in comprehensive sexuality education undermines traditional family values. And the best model of a family is a mother and a father who stay together, they're married, and they bring up their own kids. And that's what children should be taught as traditional family values. And I would, all that legislation that you've spoken about is all legislation that is a sort of a progression of LGBT ideology. You've got one thing and another and another.
Would you reverse the Gay Adoption Act?
Yeah, absolutely, because children should not be given for adoption with homosexual couples. They should be
That's wrong. Why not?
That's wrong. Because a man and a woman who are married is the best model of a family.
No,
and children have better outcomes.
What about if you have a child who is in care? I don't care whether you finished or not. It's my job to interrupt you when you're talking rubbish.
Well, I'm not talking rubbish because this is
what happens. What happens?
Study that's been shown,
David,
shows that children.
I'll cut your microphone if you don't shut up.
In general, with a man and a woman who are married.
David, you're wrong.
So that's why.
David, you're wrong. Can I just say why?
I'm not wrong.
You are 100% wrong.
We do agree on
something.
something.
You may agree to disagree.
Will you please let the panel speak?
To your own opinion. You're entitled to have your own opinion.
David, all right,
I'll ask you to leave the studio in a second. You're a complete fool of yourself.
Let them have a go. Let's agree to disagree on that.
Isn't it amazing? And yet, I would bet that in this room we've all had some sort of similar interaction with somebody that simply holds a different point of view, but is wanting to put themselves in a position where they believe that their opinion is more significant, more worthy, and more right than yours. Okay, so we see that the attack on free speech is not just coming from the state, from the globalist entities, from the so-called philanthropists, from all the people that Brian's been talking about. It is coming from our peers because they have been indoctrinated and led to believe that what they cling to is more significant than that which we cling to. It is a terrific threat, and yet people are still willing to believe that this sort of thing doesn't happen in the United Kingdom because we're decent Brits and it can't be like this. This happens in other places. So we'll just have a quick look at what it is the government has been talking about and is talking about, and whether or not they regard free speech as being a thing. So this came out last year, admittedly, obviously the last government, the National Action Plan for the Safety of Journalists. Sounds like an extraordinary concept. If we can go on to the next one, we'll see just one sentence from it, which they suggest a world where journalists are silenced by either fear or censorship is a much poorer one. This government, which was elected on a manifesto commitment to defend the freedom of the press, will be robust in shielding them from both. Well, I don't think that's been upheld, and I don't think it's going to change, even though that is, of course, the principle by which this Labour government is suggesting they're going to do things. So we see from their manifesto their only reference to free speech is here, which is we will ensure members of devolved legislatures have the same free speech protections enjoyed by MPs at Westminster, so elected representatives can hold power to account. I don't think I really need to articulate how laughable this is, but where does it come from, and are we right to draw comparisons from history? I think so, and I take you back to what became known as the Editor's Laws in Germany in 1933, from which there are a few details pulled out. The language is disturbing today as it was then. Involvement in the shaping of the intellectual contents of the newspapers or political periodicals published in the Reich, whether through writing, news reporting, or illustration, or through appointment as chief editor, is a public function regulated by the state through this law. Sounds very familiar, I think. And we go on to the next one. The Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda will determine which periodicals are to be considered political within the meaning of the law. The Reich Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda may decree the removal of an editor from the professional list independent of the proceedings of the professional court if he deems it necessary for pressing reasons of public welfare. So things move on perhaps in time, but not necessarily in sentiment. And I think it is very easy to point towards some of the things that are really coming round again. So we've got all these restrictions which we've seen. Again, I don't need to explain exactly what it is and how we've seen it, but obviously the right of assembly, freedom of the press, confiscation of printed works of disinformation, and of course the suspension of free speech, something we've seen very much in the last few years. But how exactly? And as a comparison, we'll just look at some of the legislation that's in place now that enables government to do this. And of course, first of all, in the shutting down of free speech, we have the Online Safety Act, which I'll get into a bit later, and indeed a National Security Act, the criminalising of protest by the Police Crime Courts and Sentencing Act, and indeed the Public Order Act, not just 2023, but also 1986, which again I will try and come on to a bit later. Surveillance, the Investigatory Powers Act, and the Digital Information and Smart Data Bill, however that's going to progress down the track. And then we go on to the unaccountability to law, so the Judicial Review Act and the Covert Human Intelligence Act, which effectively allows state agents to break the law willy-nilly to whatever end they consider appropriate, the stripping of citizenship by the Nationality and Borders Act, and the control of education, of course, completely critical to anything that's going to achieve fruition in the fullness of time, is to control the children, something Brian talks about an awful lot, but here we have the homeschool register. Now, how does the government enable or affect this? What levers does it have at its disposal? UK column viewers will be very familiar with this slide, and I'm not going to go through it in minute detail, but the architecture that is in place, and we consider the clip we've just seen from Gordon Brown, this has been in the making for a long, long time, but we shouldn't consider it to be a surprise or indeed something that we cannot defeat and frustrate. And I go back to the notion of being together and fighting the narrative and the element of state control that has come to pervert our lives. But just to go on to the nuts and bolts of how this is done and how it should not be permitted to be done, we have from the UK Defence Journal 77 Brigade, which I'm sure you're all aware of, but just to illustrate how remarkably a brigade set up to deal with what was described as a cyber threat, an external cyber threat, has been transformed into an organisation that studies the activities of British citizens within, and you can see in 2020 a virtual doubling in the budget. Now, I don't know if anyone has spent any time in the armed forces and has any idea what a brigade should be. It's worth pointing out that 77 Brigade is in effect a staff brigade, so it doesn't have troops at its disposal. It's very small, and it means that this funding increase is actually much more significant than it would be for an ordinary brigade. And here we have the Defence Cultural Specialist Unit within it, specifically tasked with monitoring internet content related to COVID-19 vaccines. Does that sound like an appropriate activity for the armed forces of this country? I don't think it does. And we go on to see a little bit more detail, made up of reservists and civilian analysts deployed, or at least can be, to Afghanistan and Iraq, and later deployed, of course, within the United Kingdom. And again, another thing that we've talked about a lot is the integrated operating concept, which goes back to this idea of there being a threat, not just foreign, but also domestic. And I should point out on 77 Brigade that we have this terrific conflict of interest presented most obviously by Tobias Ellwood, who, of course, has been a serving member of Parliament and a reservist within 77 Brigade, which seems wholly inappropriate. And in fact, recently, I was speaking on the news this week about Mark Lancaster, Lord Lancaster, who is also a reservist, Major General in the Royal Engineers as a reservist, but was the Deputy Commander of 77 Brigade in the beginning of 2020, and he is now with oversight, or had oversight, of what was Operation Northmoor, which was the investigation into extrajudicial killings in Afghanistan by special forces. So the degree to which all of these corrupt systems are enmeshed in one another is perfectly extraordinary. And then, of course, we have the ability to transmit what might be called soft power, but is, of course, effective interference in the affairs of other states, something that we're always very keen to accuse others of doing to us when we know perfectly well that's not the case. But here we have Juliet Harkin speaking about the work of the BBC Media Action, something that Brian talks about a lot on the news, as does Mike. And she says here, quite clearly stating that BBC Media Action worked in 2004 with individuals within the Syrian ministry who wanted change and tried to get them to be the drivers of that. Now, whose idea does that make it sound like, and who indeed is going to be the beneficiary? And of course, the next thing we come on to, which was articulated in the clip that I showed of David fighting a very brave battle up against rabid lunatics, frankly, who were completely unprepared to be challenged on either an emotional or an intellectual basis. And this is the terrifying thing about the shutting down of free speech, is that it removes any possibility for rational debate. But here we see this organisation, NewsGuard, which now has been given status as a sort of grand arbiter of material that's in the public forum, as though somehow they are able to say what is appropriate, what is not appropriate, what is right, what is not right. And this is something that does not get questioned nearly enough. And this is what filters down to the conversations we have at a personal level, because people are led to believe by what they see in mainstream media and coming out of the mouths of politicians to think that they can, in some way, act as arbiter within their peer group. But why should that privilege fall to them? Ofcom, again, an organisation we'll come back to, but very much part of the architecture of this extraordinary encroachment on free speech. And again, here we see Brian used a slide that referred to stealth. And stealth, of course, is the greatest asset that these controllers have, because things are set in motion quietly, using very well-clothed language of doublespeak in order that people do not understand what it is that's being changed, only to find out too late. And here we see, for example, so using what's called age assurance in order to facilitate access to pornography of all things. But the point is, what does it do? It pushes people into the digital prison of identity wallets, open banking, photo ID matching, all these things for your safety, for your convenience. And yet, consider, of course, who Ofcom is sponsored by, the very organisations whose homework it is supposed to mark, exactly like the MHRA. But we don't want to get sidetracked by that. But, and so just to illustrate again, the synergies between bodies that really should not be hand in glove with one another. And we see here Peter Kyle, the Secretary for DSIT, Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, communicating directly with Melanie Dawes, Chief Executive of Ofcom, effectively wanting to craft a situation by which they can catch all the naughty people that they don't want to be able to speak out. And he says, I know you and everyone working at Ofcom share my concerns about the proliferation of extremely detrimental material online, which is often far too easy to access. And he goes on, I appreciate your organization's hard work to date in setting up the regulatory regime for the Online Safety Act 2023. Further, he says, I'm writing on a related issue regarding the so-called small but risky services, which is an area of concern that has been raised with me directly. One wonders who by. The Act was designed to ensure that tech companies take more responsibility for the safety of their users. I am therefore keen to understand how Ofcom will monitor these small but risky online services. So a key phrase there, taking more responsibility for the safety of their users, and this relentless push to convince people that they are all these frail, vulnerable people. Without the protection of the state, they would simply collapse in a heap. And yet, we are never permitted these days to take responsibility for our own actions, our own decisions, our own forays into the world of communications, whether it be electronic or indeed in person. So this is highly disturbing language, and on the theme of highly disturbing, actually I have to say I didn't put the photograph on this slide, so don't blame me. But this is going back. If you can remember Hancock having a presence before the sort of the pantomime started in 2020. He was DCMS. He was Culture, Media and Sport back in 2018. And again, look at the language he's using. The first area I want to look into is accuracy. Now, who decides that? Where we're saying real threats to our media, to our society as a whole, is disinformation, also known as fake news. And he keeps going. If an individual published it online, it would be untouched by media regulation. So again, it must be regulated, and this is exactly what I mean when I say that this has pervaded the consciousness of the individual, because everybody feels like they have a right and a duty to do that to the people that they rub shoulders with on a daily basis. So we'll carry on. I tremble at the thought of a media regulated by the state in a time of malevolent forces in politics. My goodness, what foresight he had. Get this wrong, and I fear for the future of our liberal democracy. I mean, had I not told you that was written in, or said rather, in 2018, I wonder what you would have guessed. But it is very, very disturbing to read, and it just, it shows, again, a phrase we use on UK Column a lot, the direction of travel. But he finishes off by talking about the Cairn Cross Review, exploring whether intervention may be required to safeguard the future of our free and independent press. Yes, you bet intervention was required, will be required, and that juggernaut will not stop moving. So it's up to all of us to do what we can continually to thwart and push back on every aspect of this. Now, the other big part of this, or at least part of the sales pitch, insofar as the justification for these sorts of measures is concerned, is trust, the element of trust. We always talk about trust, who we can trust, who we can't. And again, it's never left up to us to decide who we may want to trust. The government has a very strong track record of setting out for us who it is we may trust. And we have from the House of Commons, Hancock's former department, of course, what's called trusted voices. Now, you might have to hold your nose for this one, but the pandemic has brought home just how vital it is to be able to access authoritative information. We highlighted in our 2020 report on misinformation how online hoaxes and conspiracies had been allowed to spread across social media, had been allowed to spread. Gosh, however, the problem is not confined to COVID-19. No, indeed not. It impacts a range of issues such as climate change, 5G, water fluoridation, elections, and those claiming UK terror attacks have been staged. This makes it all the more important that there are prominent, trustworthy actors or trusted voices who can provide evidenced, accurate information and communicate it in an accessible way. I mean, apart from the incredibly patronizing tone of this piece, it is staggering that people would be able to read this and not think that they were being completely manipulated by it and the government that put it out. Nonetheless, they go on. We believe that the government could do more to utilize the vast number of experts it employs, building on the critical role played by the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Officer during the pandemic to engage publicly in issues of national concern. Well, that hasn't turned out so well. Most recently, of course, even The Telegraph reporting that Chris Whitty has admitted something which, of course, was perfectly clear before day one, that he was concerned now that he may have overstated the danger of COVID at the start of the pandemic. And just as a personal aside, this idea of trusted voices, I think, again, people don't even appreciate how this has changed. As somebody who has not owned a television for more than 20 years, when I do occasionally look at, for example, the state propaganda outfit that is the BBC, I'm always amazed at how every story is broken down into the same format, which is that a subject is presented and then we have our minds made up for us by somebody that we are supposed to think of as being a good person, a trusted voice. It usually seems to be David Beckham or Tom Hanks, mainly on the basis that I don't recognize anyone else. But it is absolutely the formula, and it's as mundane and banal as saying that so-and-so has tweeted about this or done a social media video about it. And yet, of course, people, the idea of dumbing down and reducing everything to the lowest common denominator is a real thing, and it's very, very observable, and I think particularly to people who do only sort of dip in and out of this stuff. Anyway, they go on, and of course, we talk now about the proper Orwellian language. The government's counter-disinformation unit leads the operational response to disinformation for the UK government and works with a range of partners, including other government departments, social media platforms, civil society groups, and academia. My goodness, academia, of course. Well, there's not time really to go into that in terms of how censored academia is and what the result of that is for younger people. But nonetheless, specifically now, what we really confront, and at UK Column, this is very much sort of brought to the fore because of the extraordinary powers of the Online Safety Act. Now, again, on the news, this was talked about a lot as it was going through Parliament, and the ramifications are too great in number and too significant to go into huge detail now. But this clause here, Section 179, and indeed Section 180, which we'll come on to, are very, very disturbing indeed. And in a sense, there's no need necessarily to read it out, but what this states is that it's taken from previous legislation, Malicious Communications Act and the Communications Act 2003, this idea of false communication. So essentially, people who are putting information into the public domain that they know to be false. But of course, going back to the idea of who the arbiter may be, who decides whether they knew that it was false? Who, first of all, decides whether it is actually false? So we have this idea of false information being put out in order to achieve the effect of non-trivial psychological or physical harm. And yes, if you are setting out to cause such things, that is not a good thing to be doing. However, if we look at section 180, whilst it may be an offence for you or I to do such a thing, the provisions of section 180 mean that the recognised news publishers, which of course are the mainstream entities, cannot commit an offence under that section. So that means that a recognised news publisher may put out information they know to be false with the specific intent of causing non-trivial psychological or physical harm, and yet not commit an offence. That is quite a staggering place to find ourselves in 2024, well, indeed 2023 with the thing. And of course, it cannot be committed by the holder of a licence under the Broadcasting Act 1990 or 1996, effectively meaning the BBC and Channel 4. Now, I know that time is pushing on, so we'll just look quickly at Ofcom, and what I'm going to want to get to is how all of this pertains specifically to what it is you're doing, what the Heritage Party is doing. So this is really just a quick one under the theme of people jumping before they're pushed. And we saw this an awful lot during the sort of much vaunted pandemic, which was that an idea was floated, and before even an off-the-cuff bit of legislation was drawn up, people had willingly shut down whatever it was, or stop doing this, that, and the other. And this just goes to show Ofcom here, putting it out, in a few months, new safety duties under the Online Safety Act will be in place, but you can act now. There is no need to wait to make your sites and apps safer for users. In other words, they are suggesting that they would like things to go in a particular way, but then they don't really even have to legislate. And it is quite extraordinary the degree to which society will now self-censor, self-regulate, and do all those things that are being pushed, but actually don't even require an enormous commitment of parliamentary or governmental time to make it happen. And then we have just a few rather terrifying examples. I'm not going to read them all out. I suspect you are familiar with them, but this is another means by which influence can be directed in a hard sense, and journalists have become subject to a raft of absolute abuses of power. And I say that as somebody who, albeit for a short time, did spend time policing and does have an awareness of how to conduct oneself and how not to. And we've seen Sarah Wilkinson, Richard Medhurst, and then we've got one more after this, Richard Barnard, all taken to one side effectively with the flagrant abuse of the terrorist legislation. And this is very chilling indeed. Schedule 7 is the one that I'd like to draw your attention to, just to make it clear how the system is completely crafted in order specifically that it may be manipulated against us, against you. So Schedule 7 provides police with powers to examine people who pass through the borders. They can be stopped, questioned, and when necessary, searched, detained to determine whether they're involved in terrorism. However, significant detail, of course, is that, if we go on one, this examination is not conditional upon having grounds to suspect that they are engaged in terrorism. The decision may not be arbitrary, though. Well, how on earth do you tell? So we can see quite clearly that this is being wielded as a very, very blunt instrument to terrorize people, begging the question, who are the terrorists? Section 1 of the Terrorism Act. Terrorism means the use or threat of action where the use or threat is designed to influence or intimidate the public or a section of the public, and the use or threat is made for the purpose of advancing a political, religious, or ideological cause. I think I know who fits that description very well. Now, I'm don't want to run over, so I think I will actually just canter through these slides, because what I want to get into very quickly is just the way in which the system is driven in a direction that thwarts you. And this is the Electoral Commission effectively saying, there was a lot of controversy about hustings, particularly in the general election this year, because people were deemed to have been shut out. But of course, the point is that the Electoral Commission stand to one side and say, well, it's nothing to do with us. Effectively, hustings can go ahead, and either they can seek to give airtime to a particular party or not. But the Electoral Commission doesn't have any remit by which somebody can say, well, you do have to include us. Oh, no, you absolutely don't. And this is the difference between selective and non-selective hustings. Ofcom, again, reinforcing exactly the same thing about due weight given to particular parties based on past electoral support. Well, how does that work for the Heritage Party, for example? Anyone, an independent candidate, somebody who's started up from scratch and is just trying to make headway. And of course, this is all on the discretion of the broadcaster or of the editor. So the entire system is very, very deliberately skewed against those that do stand up to challenge the narrative. Now, just to finish on a note of mutual benefit, yes, it's a plug for UK Column, but if you haven't listened to the interviews that both Madeline and David have done with Brian, please do, because they are absolutely fascinating and they will invigorate you and re-inspire you about what it is you're doing and why. So please listen to those. Also, if you want to follow up on the idea of free speech and censorship, please look, first of all, at this article by Philip Ridley, which has come out recently. Britain had the First Amendment first, and for a more detailed look at this whole piece, censored on the UK Column website. So sorry to wrap up in slightly sort of double time, but nonetheless, I should just thank you all very much indeed for having me here to speak. David, thank you very much indeed. Madeline, to everybody else who's organised today. It's been very well put together. I'm really impressed, and I wish you all a huge amount of luck. Also, I really look forward to talking to people at lunchtime. I'm sorry I've gone at about 500 miles an hour, but such is life. Anyway, let's fight all of this stuff together, and particularly the area of free speech, because this is what we're all about as people, communicating with each other, respecting people through communication, and not shutting the whole thing down. Thank you very much indeed.